I can see the final Path of Exile 2 early access live stream right now. Black screen. Slow fade into a girl with red hair, wielding a rapier, slight wrinkles above her eyes. A map device starts in the background. Screen goes black. Then you hear this.
Still sane, Exile?
Said by the almighty Zana in as dramatic a way possible as the live stream date fades onto the screen. It's okay grinding your games. You can steal it. That's fine. Exiles, we all know the new Path of Exile 2 campaign is going to be lit and do an incredible job introducing brand new players to the game. But where Path of Exile historically steals one's soul is in its endgame. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Once you hit the epilogue of Path of Exile 1, grinding your games absorbs your soul into their metaphorical phylactery, and there's no escaping, unless Blizzard somehow comes in and crushes it with a legendary Holy Avenger. As we look toward the future of Path of Exile 2, we know what one of the final reveals shall be. It's one of the biggest and most anticipated reveals too. It's what the endgame of Path of Exile 2 will be, at least in the beginning. In this video, I'd like to swiftly explain how Path of Exile 1's endgame changed over the years, beginning with its first real endgame system in version 2.4, Atlas of Worlds. Next, I'd like to explore what we've heard about Path of Exile 2's endgame systems. We've received a few tidbits over the past 5 years about POE2's endgame, but I'd like to focus on a couple statements uttered over the past year and a half, as older statements are unlikely to hold much weight given how much the game has evolved. Finally, I'd like to go over what I think would be peak Path of Exile 2 endgame. In particular, I'd like to go over 5 possible POE2 endgame formats: Coliseum, Delve, Maps, Heist, Sanctum, and Ascent. Yeah, I know that's 6. I slipped an extra cool one right in there. After all that, I'd love if you let me know what your perfect Path of Exile 2 endgame experience might be in the comments below. And I'd also love for you to press the like button if you end up liking this video, subbing to the channel, and sharing it with your friends. That's all entirely free to you and a massive way to support my growth. But first, let's speed through Path of Exile 1's endgame evolution, as we know Path of Exile 2's endgame shall be heavily influenced by it. Before version 2.4, Atlas of Worlds, endgame was basically non-existent in Path of Exile 1. You ran through the 2 to 4 acts 3 times on progressively harder difficulties, then ran basic maps with no extra pinnacle bosses or flair involved, with the endgame consisting of a single map before additional maps were added, the current unique map, the Maelstrom of Chaos. Then, in the 2.4 expansion Atlas of Worlds, the Atlas system was introduced. This gave you a way to progress through maps and eventually face off against 4 more difficult bosses that guarded the hardest boss in the game, the Shaper. Additionally, you were able to edit the modifiers on your maps even further by placing down temporary sextants onto the Atlas. There were a bunch of other extraneum systems here, like Shaper's Orbs, but we'll just rush right over them. Not too long after, the next endgame expansion released in version 3.1 with the War for the Atlas, wherein 32 new maps were introduced and another pinnacle boss, the Elder, was added. This patch also added influenced items and modifiers to the game, which gave fighting the Shaper, Elder, and their minions even more rewards. These influenced mods could not be found on any other items in the game and were extremely powerful. The Atlas was also changed to contain Shaper and Elder territories, which you had to chase around the Atlas, running the proper maps to get them to collide and eventually spawn the necessary fights. From what I've heard, people absolutely despised this mechanic. The blobs chasing them around the Atlas, it was not fun. One patch later, in 3.2 Bestiary, the Uber Elder fight entered the game, becoming the hardest Path of Exile boss fight yet, in which you fought the Elder and Shaper at the same time in the Elder's arena. Announced at the tear-jerking ExileCon 2019, patch 3.9 Conquerors of the Atlas was the next endgame expansion for Path of Exile 1, wherein the epilogue story completely changed, shifting the mechanics of the Atlas and its pinnacle boss progression to end with a battle against Cirrus, Awakener of Worlds, instead of the Shaper and Elder. However, those fights remained available. The coolest new feature was the ability to upgrade all maps to the highest tier in the game, P16, using Watchstones, which you earned by downing the 4 Conqueror bosses aside from Cirrus over and over. Additionally, the Atlas was split into regions, and sextants could now be applied to the Watchstones for that reason, causing its modifiers to affect all maps in that region instead of just affecting one map and every other map in that map's radius. 4 new influence types and associated modifiers were also added, one for each Conqueror besides Cirrus. Might I also add that Cirrus Awakener of Worlds also dropped his own special type of Watchstone, unique Watchstones, which drastically could change the Atlas. We'll see more on Watchstones like that in just a moment. No one expected another tremendous shakeup just 4 leagues later. The next endgame expansion was 3.13 Echoes of the Atlas, wherein a new endgame boss was added, the Maven, whose progression stood in parallel with the Conqueror's progression. Multi-boss battles were also added in the Maven's Crucible, wherein we could collect up to 10 bosses to fight at once, or collect a special set of pinnacle bosses to also fight at once, like the Feared Fight, wherein you could fight the Elder, Shaper, Uberatziri, Chayula, and Cortex all at once, with the Maven interfering in the battle. On top of this, each Atlas region now also had a passive skill tree, which allowed you to edit the mechanics found in that region and how they played out. This was an astonishing addition to the game. This expansion also added craftable Watchstones, which dropped from Maven multi-boss fights, which could further affect found mechanics in maps. Also keep in mind, this was the last endgame expansion wherein Grinding Gear Games still believed that Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2's endgames would merge at the end of the day. This changed in 2021 after the Ultimatum expansion, wherein they thought, okay, we're gonna have to split out Path of Exile 2. Finally, we said farewell to Zana, our master cartographer and resident monster. The final big endgame expansion in Path of Exile 1 for the time being was 3.17 Siege of the Atlas, which added 4 new pinnacle bosses to the game, replaced the Conqueror's endgame story but left those bosses in, removed the Watchstone system, added 2 new item influence types which added implicit modifiers to items, introduced Eldritch crafting, and most important of all, removed the region-specific Atlas passive skill trees and added a single Atlas-wide passive skill tree. Siege of the Atlas was released on February 4th, 2022. Since then, there's been multiple smaller endgame updates, like the addition of Uber bosses, new Atlas keystones, and Tier 17 maps, but nothing as Atlas-shaking as these 5 updates. Why? Well, Grinding Gear Games has obviously been preparing for Path of Exile 2, and for its endgame systems, of course. Just like you should be preparing for POE2 with the sponsors of today's video, Into the AM! As we come closer and closer to Path of Exile 2's early access launch, us exiles must be prepared to hunker down and prepare to immerse ourselves in the world of Rayclast or slaughter endless hordes of monster packs. We want to be stylish, we want to be warm, and most importantly, we want to be comfy. That is why I am once again bringing you a spectacular message from today's sponsor, Into the AM. This stellar online clothing company has once again decided to sponsor the channel because all you totally sane exiles love their graphic tees and plain tees so much. Well, now you know they also have great sweatpants and sweatshirts like this Dino Green combo right here. It's genuinely perfect for sitting down and playing a casual 12-hour session of POE2, or dancing like an absolute madman to show off a full outfit. Between November 13th and December 8th, Into the AM has their biggest sale of 2024, with up to 60% off items in their store and an additional 10% off using my link. This combo right here, the shirt, is about $15 US right now with the sale alone as of recording this video on November 13th. This is an amazing time for you to purchase some comfy POE2 degen clothes or a few gifts for your amazing family and fellow exiles. You know it needs to happen. It's a good idea in the long term. They're selling graphic tees, basic tees, outerwear, sweatshirts, hoodies, pants, you name it. I 100% recommend what I am wearing right now, a crew neck sweatshirt and jogger combo. The prices right now, as I said, are literally insane. Once again, check out Into the AM's whole store and click my link below for an additional 10% off, with items already being marked up to 60% off. Huge thanks to Into the AM for sponsoring this video, and to you, my fellow exile, for not skipping the ad. You didn't skip the ad, right? Okay, now here's what we know about Path of Exile 2's endgame, and it's not a lot. There's this paragraph on the official Path of Exile 2 website that outlines what the base endgame system might be. Explore a new endgame. At the conclusion of Path of Exile 2's 6-act campaign, you'll gain access to its endgame. Each of the more than 100 endgame maps has its own boss fight and modifiers that enable revamped versions of many of Path of Exile's past leagues. We'll reveal more details of the surprises that await you in Path of Exile 2's endgame in the lead up to release. Then there's various snippets from Path of Exile 2 game director Jonathan Rogers from multiple recent interviews, like his chat with Woody Joe, wherein he discusses the need for there to be a substantial endgame at the start of early access, larger than POE2's current competition, and the fact that they're using everything they learned from Path of Exile 1 as a foundation. Finally, there's this juicy bit of information from another Jonathan interview from Gamescom 2024, in which he discusses how the team has been hard at work on multiple endgame systems for a bit now, and this was back in August, on the 25th, just about 3 months ago. And that's it. That's all we know. Using few word instead of many word, Path of Exile 2's endgame involves maps like in POE1 and draws from POE1 League content. It should be larger than competition, but not POE1's endgame, and they've been focusing on it for at least 4 months. Now here's where I'm throwing it to myself and all you exiles. What would be your peak Path of Exile 2 endgame experience during early access and beyond? Here's my unhinged vision, beginning with Coliseum. This concept is super simple and one my little brain would greatly enjoy. I presume many of you would also desire something like this in Path of Exile 2. Sometimes you truly want to turn off your mind, not walk through a zone and just kill monsters. This is when you go to the Coliseum. You go in, maybe you pay for a ticket or something with gold that you can re-earn in the Coliseum, then you fight waves and waves of monsters with bosses at every 10 intervals, with a total of 100 intervals. This could be a combination of Delirium, Simulacrum, and Ultimatum from POE1, but instead of facing very similar monsters and picking modifiers and items to win after every wave, you'd pick from a set of 3 different monster packs every wave, with each rewarding a certain class of item, whether it's currency, weapons, armor, uniques, pure gold, or something special. The structure is limited to 100, as I see this as a prime opportunity for mind-numbing monster slaying, yes, but also a way to introduce a leaderboard of sorts into the game for the Coliseum, based on speed and difficulty. Perhaps each pack you choose can have a difficulty class, so players can race to see who can clear the Coliseum the fastest at the highest difficulty. Oh, and if you die, you're done. It's a little taste of hardcore if you're not already playing it. Also imagine the environments could shift every 10 waves or so too, using different tile sets with some Coliseum traps as well. Bring back some of the labyrinth traps for this and tie it into somehow to the Eternal Empire and the already existing Sarn Arena or the Grand Arena. This would definitely need a commentator too, in the same vein as the Trial Master for Ultimatum. I could totally see this being an entertaining facet of POE2 endgame that, if implemented by Grinding Gear Games, will likely do what other games in the genre have done, but do it better. Now let's dig deep and prosper and look at Delve. Come on, this is one of Jonathan Rogers' favorite league mechanics. It has to be in Path of Exile 2, right? And if it is, and I really hope it is, I wish they'd do something wild with it, starting with one huge change. Make it standalone, something that's the case for every endgame system on my peak pinnacle wishlist. Make it so there's no need to go get Sulfite from another place, likely maps. Allow players to stay and delve for as long as they'd like, and turn it into a prosperous endgame experience, unique from anything else. I know this opinion is controversial, and Grinding Gear Games likes to send players through different endgame systems to collect different things, but I think they can accomplish this by making the rewards and gameplay types of these different systems unique enough. A great way to do this is to significantly expand the content inside the Azurite Mine or Azurite Labyrinth or whatever it's called in POE2. And how can they do this? Well, I'd posit they could add league mechanics that cannot stand alone in POE2 into POE2's version of Delve. Here's what I mean. Say Harvest is out from Path of Exile 2. No Sacred Grove or any of that found in areas. Why not roll its aesthetics, revamped monsters, revamped minor systems, and revamped boss encounters into Delve? It could be its own entire biome with yellow, purple, and blue shiny beasts only found in Delve. alongside a rudimentary form of special crafting. Same with scourged maps from Path of Exile 1. Add them as a Delve biome. Abyss not making the cut? Add all its revamped bosses into an expanded Abyss Delve biome, and so on and so forth. I think it'd be an easy, awesome, and cool win to roll the ancient Path of Exile 1 leagues into Delve, almost like they're buried deep below Rayclast. This also makes room for plenty of other new league mechanics in other areas of Path of Exile 2. Like this next endgame system that I know we all know and love. Without a doubt, some form of mapping shall be the core system in Path of Exile 2's endgame. We know campaign bosses shall repeat in endgame with updated and changed abilities, and that pinnacle bosses shall also exist, alongside revamped POE1 League content. But what else should make it from POE1? I'd argue two big systems, at the least. The Atlas passive skill tree, or a form of it, and the idea of chasing down a set of at least 4 core pinnacle bosses to start. Everything else is extra in early access. These are the two things they need to implement well in POE2's endgame and fast, alongside any other flourishes that they decide to add. I'm also adamant chase rares should live in at least some form from mapping and the bossing it spawns, perhaps in the form of influence types. This could be one of the unique and powerful rewards you receive from participating in POE2 mapping, as opposed to the other 4 endgame systems I'm wishing on a star for in this video. And yes, if it wasn't obvious, I am hoping for Zana, but 20 years older. With a reset on the power level, I posit maps might be more similar to how we go on expeditions in Path of Exile 1. Maps to actual places in the world as opposed to imaginary worlds in the Atlas. What we all must remember is, with every league since 3.9 or so, the Path of Exile team has been testing Path of Exile 2 core mechanics and ideas in Path of Exile 1. It's very likely some of these concepts create the fundamental elements of Path of Exile 2 systems we've not yet seen. We can probably look at every single league in the past while and pull something new and interesting that they have in them, and we're probably going to see it in Path of Exile 2. I'm certain that the Affliction Ascendancies were experiments for how Ascendancies might work in Path of Exile 2. Same with the Charms. They're basically Forbidden Flesh and Forbidden Flame, but in a very different form. Perhaps that's how we can mix and match certain Ascendancy nodes in Path of Exile 2. The Crucible weapon skill trees, I posit those are somehow somewhere in Path of Exile 2 in some form, or at one point or another, they were considering adding something like that into Path of Exile 2. I know the people at Grinding Gear Games are geniuses. They kept innovating Path of Exile 1's endgame expansion after expansion for a good stretch there. What in the world might they do to evolve it further in Path of Exile 2? All I know is we'll find out soon, and I'm certain this endgame system shall be present in Path of Exile 2 Early Access. Something I can rob myself of saying about this next endgame experience. Heist, I think, is already unique enough as a standalone system and was, I am confident, made with Path of Exile 2 in mind. It came around the time when they thought both games would share an endgame and obviously uses a ton of high quality assets just as Path of Exile 2 does. When it first came out in 2020, its gameplay was a bit slower paced, more methodical. With some balancing, Heist can just plop right into Path of Exile 2 with no real large changes, aside from revamped rewards and updated boss fights. Additionally, if they develop the stealth-based mechanics and how we were meant to maneuver between packs, this could actually be a refreshing side of Path of Exile 2 to try out now and then, and an absolutely beloved piece of content by a select few, especially if it's self-sustaining, as I believe it should be. The lore will also need to be modernized. There's a lot that happens in 20 years in Rayclast, unless you're an immortal warlock living in a deep, dark crypt. Sanctum, or at least the concept of it revamped for Path of Exile 2, is essentially a shoe-in for this game. It's slower paced for the most part. You rely on dodging and not getting hit, a fundamental part of Path of Exile 2. It adds a beloved type of game genre into POE2 and is endlessly replayable. It creates the opportunity for an absolutely wild chase reward and achievement for the most skilled players among us. Locking a powerful unique like Original Sin behind a Sanctum-like gauntlet in Path of Exile 2 would be lit. Much like Heist, I cannot see Sanctum not ending up in POE2 eventually. It feels like it was designed with Path of Exile 2 in mind, and with minor revamps and reskins, I think we'll find ourselves going deeper into the Sanctum than ever before. Maybe we'll even get some sanctified relics back. Oh yes, account-bound uber powerful items. Those weren't controversial at all, and I posit, I truly do, this was another Path of Exile 2 experiment. After this Forbidden Sanctum talk, where to go but up? There's an amazing league idea people have pitched to grinding your games for a long time, and they've even discussed it at times too. No, it's not Boat League. It's a Delve but Up League. I posit Path of Exile 2's first major league or endgame expansion, perhaps as we emerge from early access, shall tackle this idea, and it shall be called Path of Exile 2 1.0 Ascent. How lit does that sound? As the core mechanic, to differentiate it from something like Delve, I have a super simple but cool idea. You're ascending up some gargantuan structure, like the Scepter of God in Path of Exile 1 that you climb to fight Dominus, and instead of fighting tons of monster packs, the Ascent is basically a boss rush minigame within Path of Exile 2. Path of Exile 2 is massively focused on bosses. Why not add a boss rush style league mechanic or endgame mechanic into the game? Sort of like the smash hit Black Myth Wukong. In one area you fight the wild matron Ursia. In the next you're fighting the blind beast. Then you're fighting the prisoner, and then you're fighting the crowbell, and then you're fighting the executioner, and then you're fighting the Iron Count, and so on and so forth. That sounds incredible to me. Truly, I would be a mad enjoyer of something like this in Path of Exile 2, especially with the in-depth boss design, and I think the rest of the player base drawn into Path of Exile 2 would go berserk too. So, Exiles, what are your thoughts on my peak endgame experiences in Path of Exile 2? Let me know in the comments below, and make sure if you liked the video, give it a like, and subscribe to the channel for more unique Path of Exile 2 content just like this. I'll see you in the next one. Talakara, my fellow Exiles.